Hey everyone, welcome to tonight's deep dive into the dark, gritty, and far from glamorous world of medieval assassins. These weren't the sleek, cloak-wearing superheroes you see in movies, slipping through shadows with a smirk. No, these were real people, flawed, desperate, and often one bad decision away from disaster, whose actions shaped history with a knife and a prayer. Before we get started, if you're enjoying these historical journeys, give this video a thumbs up and hit subscribe. It really helps keep the channel going. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always cool to see our global crew coming together. Now, grab a cozy blanket, maybe put on some ambient rain sounds, and let's step back into the murky past. Let's set the stage. Medieval Europe, where life was tough, and for some, it was downright brutal. Becoming an assassin wasn't anyone's childhood dream job, scribbled in the margins of a prayer book. It wasn't a career you chose. It was a grim necessity, the kind of path you stumbled onto when life had already kicked you to the curb. Forget the Hollywood image of a lone warrior trained in some misty mountain dojo. Most medieval assassins were ordinary folks pushed to the edge, landless peasants, disgraced knights, or petty thieves with a knack for staying unseen. If you had a farm, a trade, or even a single cow to your name, you weren't signing up for this gig. Wealthy people didn't wield daggers, they paid others to do it. But if you just escaped a debtor's cell, had a shady reputation, or could slip past a tavern brawl without a glance, you were prime recruit material. Someone, somewhere, would eventually sidle up to you in a dimly lit inn, slide a few coins your way, and murmur a name.
And that name? It was never someone easy like a forgettable miller or a kindly baker. No, your target was likely a scheming lord, a power-hungry bishop, or a noble surrounded by armed guards and a crocodile-filled moat. Okay, maybe not crocodiles, but you get the idea. The payout could be tempting, a sack of silver or a promise of protection, but the risks were nightmarish. By the time you took the job, you were probably already out of options. No home, no family, no hope of a normal life. And perks? Forget it. There was no Assassin's Guild offering vacation days or a retirement plan. You couldn't advertise your services with a sign reading, "Discreet Solutions, Inquire Within." You kept your mouth shut, moved fast, and prayed no one connected the dots. Bragging about your work over a tankard of ale was a one-way ticket to the gallows. "Oh, me? I'm just a humble wool merchant. Those bloodstains? Spilled wine." Let's be real. Nobody aspired to this life. Assassins were the outcasts, the ones society forgot until it needed a problem solved quietly. You weren't a hero, nor even a proper villain, just a shadow who made everyone uneasy and probably didn't live long enough to spend your earnings. Now, let's shatter the first big myth about medieval assassins. They weren't elite warriors honing their craft in secret academies surrounded by flickering torches and cryptic mentors chanting wisdom. There was no training montage, no inspirational lute music, no wise elder teaching you the art of stealth. Most assassins were self-taught through sheer survival, learning on the job by not getting caught or killed on their first attempt. If you had any prior skills, maybe from a stint as a soldier or thief, that was a bonus. A former archer might know how to aim a crossbow. A pickpocket might know how to blend into a crowd. But for most, it was less about finesse and more about desperation. Stabbing someone wasn't rocket science, but escaping a fortified castle without losing a limb, that required raw cunning or a whole lot of luck.
There were no assassin handbooks,
No secret societies with annual meetings. No how to spot a decoy 101 classes. You learned by doing, often the hard way. Historical records, like those from 13th century Europe, suggest assassins were often hired for one-off jobs with no formal training. For example, in 1192, the murder of Conrad of Montferrat, a crusader king, was likely carried out by members of the Order of the Assassins, a real group in the Middle East. But even they didn't have a standardized assassin academy. Their skills came from necessity, not a curriculum. If you were using poison, good luck. Poisoning was a gamble. Medieval toxicology was more guesswork than science. Aconite or belladonna might kill your target, or it might just give them a bad stomachache and a worse temper. Worse still, you might accidentally sip the wrong goblet. No one was rushing to invent a medieval poison hotline. If you were incredibly fortunate, you might cross paths with a seasoned rogue who'd show you a trick or two, like how to move silently on gravel or pick a basic lock. But mentorship was rare. Assassins didn't exactly trust each other, and the life expectancy in this line of work wasn't long enough for apprenticeships. Your gear was whatever you could scrounge: a knife lifted from a drunk guard, a rope for climbing, or strangling if you were creative, maybe a cloak to hide the evidence. Fancy weapons like swords were too bulky and conspicuous for a job that demanded discretion. You weren't a knight charging into battle. You were a ghost, armed with whatever didn't clank too loudly. Picture yourself as a medieval assassin: rough hands, silent steps, and a questionable obsession with dark corners and back alleys. Your training wasn't a fancy academy with hooded masters. It was the school of hard knocks, where the only diploma was surviving your first job. You learned the trade by diving headfirst, fumbling through a messy kill, and slipping away before anyone could pin your face to a wanted poster nailed to the village square. No grand ceremonies, no gold stars, just scars, sleepless nights, and the sinking feeling that you were utterly alone in this brutal world. So, why would anyone sign up for this grim gig? One word: money. Not piles of gold or glittering jewels, but the promise of a few clinking coins, enough to buy a hot meal, a dry bed, or a fleeting moment of hope. That promise was the bait, luring desperate souls into the shadows. But here's the cold truth. Clients hiring assassins weren't looking for a lifelong partnership. They wanted a quick, clean job, no receipts, no witnesses, and ideally, no loose ends, including you. They dangle a small pouch of silver, maybe pay half up front if they were feeling charitable, and say, "You'll get the rest when it's done." Sounds simple, right? Except when it's done often meant after we make sure you didn't botch it, implicate us, or live long enough to talk. You'd risk everything: sneaking past guards, scaling walls, maybe silencing a scheming duke in his sleep. It wasn't glamorous. It was sweaty, nerve-wracking work. And when you came back for your reward, too often the client had vanished into the night. Or worse, they'd greet you with a blade to your ribs. Why pay when a quick stab is cheaper? Historical accounts, like those from 14th century Italy, showed this wasn't uncommon. Assassins were often betrayed by employers, especially in cutthroat city-states like Venice or Florence, where political backstabbing was practically a sport. Even if you did get paid, the coins barely covered the toll of the job. The weeks spent hiding in a damp cellar, the fleas you picked up in a hayloft, or the gnawing guilt that followed you home. You'd get a nod, a handful of silver, and a hissed reminder: you were never here. Worse still, some jobs were outright traps. Political rivals loved setting up fake contracts to flush out enemies. You'd be hired to take out a dangerous target, only to find a squad of guards waiting, ready to drag you to the gallows. In 1327, for instance, chronicles from England describe hired killers being double-crossed in plots against nobles, their names already on execution lists before they even drew their knives. If you tried to complain about a shady deal, good luck. The local magistrate wasn't hearing cases titled, "Lord So-and-so owes me for an assassination." Your only recourse was to demand payment up front, trust no one, and always have an escape plan. Every job was a gamble, and the house usually won by shortening your life expectancy. Now let's talk about your gear. Forget the sleek gadgets of spy novels or video games. No spring-loaded blades, no magical smoke bombs, no collapsible crossbows tucked into your socks. Your toolkit was whatever you could scrape together, sharpen, or hide under a threadbare cloak without making a racket. If the stars aligned, and I mean you found a silver coin in a mud puddle aligned, you might have a decent dagger. Nothing fancy, just a plain, sturdy blade, hopefully not rusted to the point of snapping mid-job. Poison? Sure, it was an option, but not the elegant drop-in-the-chalice kind you see in films. Medieval poisons were a risky mix of herbs, minerals, or questionable concoctions like arsenic or hemlock, often brewed by trial and error. A 12th century text, De Venenis, describes poisons that could kill in minutes or leave your target retching for days, now very wary of their porridge. Sometimes you'd misjudge the dose and poison yourself instead. No apothecary was handing out antidotes for clumsy assassins.
Ropes were handy for climbing walls or, in a pinch, garroting someone. But you'd better know your knots. Fumbling with a rope while a guard's footsteps echoed closer wasn't exactly a confidence booster. Bows? They existed, but lugging one through a crowded marketplace while posing as a humble baker was a dead giveaway. Most assassinations were intimate affairs, up close, quiet, and messy. You relied on whatever you could conceal, a knife sewn into your sleeve, a cord tucked in your belt, maybe a sharpened stick if things got dire. Some assassins, as records from medieval Sicily suggest, even used everyday items like a heavy iron key or a broken bottle as improvised weapons when plans went south. You didn't have a backup arsenal. If your dagger snapped or fell into a moat, you were improvising with a loose cobblestone or, in a real pinch, a particularly aggressive shoe. Your gear wasn't just tools, it was your lifeline, your only ally in a world where betrayal was a given. You didn't have time to tinker or polish your kit between jobs. You just prayed it held up when it mattered, because in this line of work, your blade wasn't just a weapon, it was the only thing standing between you and a very short career. Imagine you're a medieval assassin, armed with little more than a dull blade and a stubborn will to survive. Your job wasn't to pick off some random tavern drunk or a forgettable blacksmith. No, your targets were the big fish, lords, bishops, war-hardened generals, maybe even a king or two. And let me tell you, taking them out was like trying to steal a dragon's hoard while it's awake and cranky. These people were hard to kill, and the obstacles in your way were enough to make anyone rethink their life choices. First, you had to deal with the guards. Whole squads of them, not just a couple of bored guys with spears. We're talking dozens of armored, well-fed soldiers, some posted at the gates, others patrolling the halls, and a few just standing there, glaring like they could smell your bad intentions.
You'd spend days, sometimes weeks, studying their routines. Which guard took a nap at midnight, which door hinge squeaked, or how long it took for the guy with the creaky knees to climb the tower stairs. One wrong move, and you were done for. Historical records, like those from 13th century France, described castle security as a nightmare for would-be assassins, with rotating patrols and signal horns to alert entire garrisons. Then there were the defenses. Castles weren't cozy cottages with welcome mats. They had towering walls, drawbridges, and moats filled with muck, or worse, things that snapped at your ankles. If you managed to avoid drowning in the moat, you still had to dodge arrow slits where archers waited, or vats of scalding pitch ready to turn you into a very unhappy candle. Yes, hot pitch was a real threat. Chronicles from the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 mentioned defenders pouring it on attackers. Your job basically came with a warning label: may involve dodging molten nightmares. Then you had the household staff. Cooks, maids, stable hands, and scribes who noticed everything. One sideways glance, and they'd be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could mutter, "I'm just here to fix the fireplace." Medieval gossip was a weapon, spreading like wildfire in tight-knit castle communities. If you didn't know the name of the baker's dog or the steward's favorite ale, you were as good as caught. And the target themselves, they were paranoid for a reason. Surrounded by scheming cousins, rival nobles, and courtiers with ulterior motives, they trusted no one. Food tasters checked every bite, doors had multiple bolts, and some even slept in secret chambers or swapped beds to throw off attackers. A 14th century Italian noble, Galeazzo Visconti, was known to rotate sleeping quarters to foil assassination plots. Trying to get close was like playing a deadly game of hide and seek, except the seeker had a crossbow. Even public events, like a grand feast, weren't the easy opportunity they seemed. Sure, your target might be tipsy on spiced wine, but so would half the room, including you if you were posing as a guest. You'd still need to slip past vigilant guards, a pack of hunting dogs with noses sharper than your blade, and a gaggle of nosy courtiers, not to mention the jester who never seemed to miss a thing. Getting to your target could take weeks of preparation, bribing a laundry maid, posing as a scullery worker, or hiding in a wine cask until your legs cramped. When the moment finally arrived, you had one chance, one perfect, silent, no-mess strike. Blow it, and you'd end up as the castle's new wall decoration, dangling from the ramparts with a sign that read, "Better luck next life." Now, let's talk about how you looked while pulling this off. Forget the sleek, black-clad ninja of your imagination, with a billowing cape and a brooding stare. In reality, you looked like a down-on-his-luck farmer who hadn't seen a bath since the last harvest. Disguises in the Middle Ages weren't exactly runway material. You made do with whatever you could scrounge: a patched-up peasant tunic, a monk's oversized robe that smelled faintly of mold, or a pilfered guard's tabard that still carried the faint whiff of its previous owner. The goal was to blend in, which meant looking like every other weary, underfed soul in the crowd, complete with a limp, a cough, or a twitch from a lifetime of bad luck. No one was handing out tailored cloaks or sneaky gadgets. Your disguise was less about style and more about not screaming "assassin" at first glance. That dagger under your belt? Wrapped in a rag to keep it quiet. A mask? Forget it. Covering your face just made people assume you had the plague, which was great for clearing a room, but terrible for sneaking into a banquet. If questioned, you had to think fast. I'm Brother Anselm, here to bless the rafters and sweep the chimney. One wrong word, and you were done.
Castle servants were sharp, and they'd notice if you didn't know the layout of the kitchens or fumbled a tray of goblets. A 15th century manual on courtly behavior, Il Galateo, hints at how tightly knit noble households were. Strangers stuck out like a sore thumb. Wigs? Not a thing. If you needed to change your appearance, you might rub dirt in your hair to look older or slouch to seem younger, but that was about it. Some assassins, as seen in accounts from medieval Spain, used crude tricks like smearing ash on their faces or tying on fake beards with twine, hardly foolproof when a curious guard got close. Your disguise wasn't armor. It was a flimsy shield, buying you a few minutes of confusion at best. You weren't a master of deception, just a desperate soul hoping no one noticed the knife-shaped bulge under your cloak. Once you were in, you had to disappear, completely. If someone saw through your flimsy disguise, you'd better hope you had a good story, because getting caught dressed as a baker's apprentice with a dagger in your boot was a one-way ticket to disaster. Picture trying to explain yourself while standing in a noble's wine cellar, wearing a stolen priest's robe, holding a garrote, with a feast going on upstairs. Good luck. In medieval times, assassins didn't have a squad to back them up. No loyal archer covering your escape, no cunning apothecary mixing potions in a hidden cave, no mentor slipping you cryptic notes with a pat on the back. It was just you, a questionable knife, and a lifetime of trust issues that could fill a cathedral.
There were no assassin guilds handing out membership cards or hosting annual banquets. If you heard rumors of a shadowy brotherhood of killers, it was likely just drunken tavern gossip, spun by bored travelers with too much ale. You were more likely to stumble across a leprechaun than meet another assassin eager to swap trade secrets. Why? Because in this line of work, anonymity was your only shield. Every person who knew your face was a potential threat. Every conversation, a step closer to the hangman's rope. Even your clients, those shady figures who hired you, rarely knew your real name. If they did, you were already halfway out the city gates, planning your next alias. Historical records, like those from 15th century Venice, suggest assassins often operated under pseudonyms, leaving no trace beyond a whispered reputation. Companionship. That was a luxury you couldn't afford. Friends asked too many questions. Lovers noticed the blood under your nails or the way you flinched at loud noises. Settling down wasn't an option, unless you counted settling into a ditch to avoid a bounty hunter. One slip-up, one moment of recognition in a bustling market, and your life became a desperate scramble for the nearest back alley. Even other criminals, thieves, smugglers, pickpockets, gave you a wide berth. They might share a drink with a forger, but you were the one who made people vanish. To them, you were less a colleague and more a walking curse. Someone whose very presence could summon an angry mob with pitchforks. A 14th century chronicle from Florence describes how even bandits shunned hired killers, fearing their reputation would draw unwanted attention. Sympathy? Don't hold your breath. You couldn't exactly pour your heart out about the nightmares that followed a job. Say the memory of silencing a corrupt merchant while his dog whimpered nearby. Confess your troubles, and people would either think you were spinning tales or realize you were a walking death warrant. So, You kept everything locked away. Your fears, your scars, your secrets. At the tavern, you claimed the darkest corner, back against the wall, eyes glued to the entrance. You sipped your ale lightly, never lingered past dusk, and gave a fake name if anyone asked. Call me Willem, the turnip peddler. Your real name? Buried deeper than your last target. Being a medieval assassin meant mastering the art of erasure, not just from a crowd, but from any chance at a normal life. You didn't just vanish into the shadows. You vanished from every dream of stability, family, or peace you might have once had.
Now, let's say you've taken the job. You've mapped out the castle, bribed a sleepy gatekeeper, and pulled off a halfway decent disguise as a wandering minstrel. Everything's going smoothly, until it isn't. Maybe your target glances your way at the worst moment. Maybe they're holding their kid's hand. Maybe your nerves betray you, and your hand shakes like a leaf in a storm. One mistake, and it's over. Failure as an assassin didn't mean a stern lecture or a demotion. It meant a gruesome, public end. Think ropes, pyres, or medieval torture devices with names like the Widow's Embrace. Miss your shot, and your target would be screaming about the attempt before you could lace up your boots. Suddenly, you're not a ghost. You're the most wanted face in the province, with your description and maybe a bad charcoal sketch plastered on every inn door from here to the next kingdom. The guards you once slipped past, they're now hunting you with a vengeance, motivated by the promise of a fat reward. And it's not just them. Your own client, the one who hired you, might turn on you faster than you can say double cross. A failed assassin wasn't an asset. They were a loose end, someone who could be tortured into spilling names. In 1378, a botched assassination attempt on a Milanese noble led to the hired killer being betrayed by his employer, who promptly hired another to silence him. There were no do-overs, no "my blade slipped, let's try again tomorrow." You had one moment to get it right, one fleeting chance to be flawless. Hesitate, and you'd be running for your life, hoping to vanish before the client decided a second contract, this time on you, was the easier solution. Failure wasn't just deadly, it was humiliating. You didn't just miss the kill, you failed to be invisible, to be perfect. And in this trade, perfection wasn't a goal, it was survival. One slip, and you might as well stitch a bullseye on your cloak and rehearse your last words. It didn't matter if you'd pulled off a dozen flawless jobs before. In this world, you were only as good as your last success. If that success never came, you'd better have a horse saddled and a head start.
You've done it. Your blade hit its mark. No screams, no alarms. Just a high-profile target slumping silently to the stone floor. Job well done, right? Wrong. Now comes the hard part, getting out alive. Being a medieval assassin didn't end with a victory toast or a dramatic pose against a burning skyline. It meant sprinting through muddy alleys, blood on your cloak, with guard dogs already catching your scent. There was no time to savor the moment, no celebratory ale, no debrief with a client who'd pat you on the back. The second your target fell, your new mission was survival, dodging everyone now itching to carve you up in ways that would make a butcher blush. You had to plan your escape before you even struck. That meant memorizing every twist of the castle's corridors, every creaky gate, and every shadowy corner where you could catch your breath. Maybe you had a smuggler friend who'd row you across a river for a few coins, no questions asked. Maybe you'd stashed a tattered monk's robe in a ditch for a quick disguise. But the clock was ticking. A successful kill triggered chaos. City gates slammed shut, patrols doubled, and checkpoints popped up with guards clutching crude sketches of you labeled armed and extremely dangerous. Historical records, like those from 14th century Paris, describe how cities locked down after high-profile assassinations, with bells ringing and militias scouring the streets. If you were lucky, you were already halfway to the next town, limping from a wound and muttering a fake name to anyone who asked. And your client? Don't expect a warm handshake and a sack of gold. If they planned to pay you at all, they weren't waiting in a cozy inn with a job well done scroll. More likely, they'd vanished into the night, leaving you to wonder if the coin was worth the trouble. A successful assassin was a walking liability, someone who knew too much, who'd already proven they could slip past locked doors and armed guards.
In 1308, after the assassination of a Bavarian noble, chronicles note that the hired killer was betrayed by his employer, who fled to avoid being linked to the crime. Even if you got paid, it came with a catch. You were now the most hunted person in the region, with a price on your head bigger than the one you just earned. Success didn't mean safety. It meant a new identity, a shaved head, and weeks of hiding in damp barns or bribing shady boatmen to get you across a border. Every job reset the game. New city, new name, new enemies. If that wasn't bad enough, you had to contend with the wild paranoia of medieval society. Assassins weren't just feared, they were practically mythical monsters in the eyes of the common folk. To a peasant, you weren't just a hired killer, you were a cursed figure, maybe even a demon's errand boy, poisoning blades with bat blood under a stormy sky. Superstition ran rampant in the Middle Ages, and logic took a backseat to fear. A 12th century text, the Book of Marvels, recounts tales of shadow men who could slip through walls or turn invisible, fueled by pacts with dark spirits. Villagers whispered that assassins could curse crops with a glance or summon fog to cover their tracks. Your dagger? Clearly forged in a haunted smithy. Your poison? Brewed with witchcraft, probably stirred with a raven's claw at midnight. You'd think this fear might work in your favor, scaring people off. Think again. Superstitious crowds didn't negotiate, they panicked. One strange death, whether from illness, a fall, or a bad batch of stew, and fingers pointed at the shadow man lurking nearby. A 1340s chronicle from England describes a mob stoning a stranger after a local merchant died suddenly, blaming him for unnatural causes. If you lingered too long in a village, someone would notice your quiet demeanor or the odd bulge under your cloak.
Priest was ringing the church bell, and a gang of farmers was waving torches, ready to burn the sorcerer before he could hex their goats. Anything unusual could seal your fate: a pouch of herbs, a foreign coin, or a slight accent. One wrong move, and you were labeled a witch or worse. Carrying a knife didn't just mark you as dangerous, it marked you as unholy. The fear wasn't just about what you did, it was about what people thought you could do. In a world where monsters hid in human skin, being too sly, too quiet, or too quick made you a walking threat. And in medieval justice, threats didn't get trials, they got fire, pitchforks, and a quick trip to the afterlife. Poison, the assassin's dream of a clean, silent kill. No clash of steel, no blood-soaked floors, just a subtle drop in a goblet, a stumble, a gasp, and it's over. That was the fantasy, at least. In reality, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a duel with a handful of weeds and a questionable plan. First, the poisons themselves were a gamble. Forget sleek vials of instant death serum or neatly labeled toxins. You were stuck with whatever you could scrounge: crushed hemlock, deadly nightshade, maybe some arsenic scraped from a miner's cart, or if you were desperate, something dubious involving a frog. You'd gather, grind, and guess, hoping your concoction worked.
But there was no precision, no medieval lab with scales and pipettes. Too little, and your target might just burp loudly and skip dessert. Too much, and you'd be the one keeling over from fumes before the soup was served. A 13th century treatise, De Venenis, warns of poisons so unreliable they could leave a victim queasy but alive, now doubly suspicious of their stew. Getting the poison to your target was another nightmare. Medieval kitchens were bustling hives of activity, not unattended pantries where you could sprinkle death like salt. You'd need to bribe a scullery maid, pose as a hurried cook, or slip in during the chaos of a feast prep, all while dodging the watchful eyes of servants who'd notice a stranger faster than you could say spiced wine. And if your target was a noble, good luck.
Their meals were guarded like state secrets. Food tasters sampled every dish, priests blessed the table, and some households even had dogs trained to sniff out trouble. Yes, dogs. Historical accounts from 14th century Florence describe noble households using tasters and animals to thwart poison plots, turning every banquet into a fortress of paranoia. By the time the venison reached the Lord's plate, it had been scrutinized more than a royal decree. Even if you managed to slip the poison past all that, the results were anyone's guess. Some toxins worked in minutes, others took days. One moment your target's toasting their allies, the next they're doubled over, demanding their physician or muttering about bad omens. If they survived, say because your hemlock was more mild tummy upset than instant demise, they'd start pointing fingers, not at the cook, not at the taster, but at the shady figure with the herb pouch and nervous twitch. Being caught with poison wasn't just a death sentence, it was a one-way ticket to a dungeon interrogation, complete with red-hot irons and questions about every death in the county. Poison wasn't elegant. It was a risky, unpredictable mess that could backfire spectacularly. Now let's say you pulled it off. You changed history, toppled a cruel lord, derailed a dynasty, or silenced a warmongering knight. Surely your name would echo through the ages, right? Not a chance. As an assassin, your legacy was meant to dissolve like mist. You weren't a hero to be celebrated, or a villain to be feared. You were a ghost, a fleeting rumor at best. Maybe you were the cloaked stranger, or the man with no name who left his ale untouched. Your client didn't want a legend, they wanted deniability. The less anyone knew about you, the safer they were from the fallout. A 12th century chronicle about the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat notes the killer was never named, only whispered about as a shadowy figure who vanished without a trace. You didn't sign your work or carve your initials into the scene. Trophies? Bragging? Those were for amateurs who wanted a noose.
If your name did surface, it was trouble. A known assassin was a loose end, and loose ends got snipped fast. Your clients, the ones who hired you to do their dirty work, would rather see you dead than risk you talking. There was no honor in this trade, no statues for the shadow who stopped a tyrant with a single stroke. If a noble wanted glory, they'd commission a marble bust of themselves, not you. Your reward was a shallow grave, an unmarked plot, or, if things went south, a head on a pike with a sign reading "Betrayer." Sometimes your name only lived on as a curse, a warning whispered in taverns, "Cross the Duke and you'll end up like Lord Baldric, gone in the night." Your legacy wasn't fame or fear, it was absence, the empty space where a person used to be. So, you've done the impossible, completed the job, escaped the guards, and even got paid, a miracle worthy of a saint. Now you just need to lie low, keep your hood up, and trust your client to keep your secret. Spoiler, they won't. In the cutthroat world of medieval assassination, one rule cut deeper than any blade: Never trust the person handing you the coin. Your client, whether a scheming noble, a greedy merchant, or a bishop with a questionable moral compass, didn't hire you out of admiration. You were a tool, the sharpest shadow they could find to do their dirty work. But the moment the job was done, you transformed from asset to threat. You knew too much. Who wanted whom dead, why, and what they'd paid to make it happen. That knowledge made you a walking danger, not just to their enemies, but to them. So what did they do? They vanished like smoke, denying they ever knew you. Or worse, they sent another killer to tie up their loose end with a blade sharper than their promises. Historical records from 14th century Italy recount tales of double contracts, where clients hired one assassin for the job and another to silence the first, ensuring no one could trace the plot back to them. No payout, just a permanent solution.
If you thought blackmailing your client would get you leverage, think again. Threatening to expose a powerful figure was like juggling torches in a hayloft. Bold, but suicidal. Medieval elites didn't negotiate with assassins, they erased them. A 1370s chronicle from France describes a hired killer who tried to extort his employer, only to end up floating face down in a river before he could utter a name. If your client had a rare flicker of integrity, you might get your coin and a chance to walk away. But even then, you'd feel their eyes on you, their spies noting your limp, your cloak, your favorite tavern. You were the secret they couldn't let breathe, the shadow they couldn't let linger. In their minds, if you'd killed once, you could kill again. And nobody, not even the one who paid you, wanted to be your next target. Now, let's say you defied the odds. You survived the jobs, the betrayals, the botched poisonings, and the double crosses. You outlasted your enemies, your clients, and maybe even your own sense of right and wrong. Time to retire, right? Wrong. Medieval assassins didn't get to hang up their daggers and settle into a quiet life by the river. There were no farewell feasts, no cozy farmhouses, no grateful lords slipping you a pension for your service. Retirement wasn't an option, it was a fantasy. Your past clung to you like damp rot. You carried too many secrets, too many names, too much blood. Even if you walked away, your enemies didn't. Neither did your clients. A retired assassin wasn't a free man. He was a target, waiting to be found. A 15th century Venetian record tells of a former killer hunted years after his last job, betrayed by a whisper from an old rival. To survive, you'd reinvent yourself again. New name, new village, new lie about who you were. Maybe you'd pose as a wandering herbalist, a limping ex-soldier, or a mute pilgrim. But peace, that was a dream you couldn't afford. You'd sleep with one eye open, a blade hidden under the floorboards, next to a pouch of coins you never dared spend, their weight heavy with memories of the lives they cost. Every creak of the door was a threat, every stranger a potential hunter. The life you'd led rewired your mind. Years of silent kills and desperate escapes left you jumping at shadows, scanning crowds for faces you might have crossed. Love, laughter, trust, those were for people who didn't know the sound of a neck snapping in the dark. You lived as a ghost in a man's skin, always moving, always watching, until the day you faded into oblivion and hoped no one noticed.
By now, it's clear. Being a medieval assassin wasn't some romantic tale of shadowy prowess. It wasn't noble, glamorous, or even particularly lucrative. It was a brutal, thankless existence, wrapped in tattered rags and haunted by a growing list of people who wanted you dead. You might step into a town, hood low, heart pounding, ready to be the whisper in the night, only to find your targets moved. The guards are rowdy with ale and itching for a fight, and the stable hand you bribed for intel just sold you out for a crust of bread. You weren't a sleek predator in control of your fate. You were cold, hungry, and one wrong step from the gallows. The life of an assassin wasn't a story of triumph. It was a desperate scramble to survive a world that didn't want you to exist. Picture yourself as a medieval assassin, heart pounding, dagger still warm from a job well done. You think you're in the clear, until you're not. One wrong move, and the whole world turns against you. Maybe you hesitated at the critical moment, struck the wrong target, or got spotted by a nosy servant who swears she saw you skulking near the church last week. In an instant, you're no longer a shadow. You're the hunted. Your only option? Run. But medieval streets weren't exactly forgiving. You're dodging slick mud, jagged cobblestones, and a surprising number of stray geese that seem to have a personal vendetta. One slip, and you're sprawled in the dirt, tackled by a guard named Baldwin who's had a bad day and sees you as his ticket to a promotion. A 14th century chronicle from London describes a would-be assassin caught after tripping over a market stall, proving the streets themselves could betray you. If you somehow escape that mess, the aftermath is no kinder. You have no allies to call, no honor to claim, no future to hope for. You're a ghost in a world that fears you, surrounded by whispers of witchcraft and treachery. Even if you pull off a dozen perfect kills, your best-case scenario is fading into obscurity in some remote hamlet, living under a false name, pretending to be a potter, while villagers gossip about fairies. The life of an assassin wasn't a thrilling saga of power. It was a relentless grind that chewed up your soul and spit out nothing but silence. You didn't shape history, you erased yourself from it. The only legacy you left was a void, unnoticed and unmourned, because in the medieval world, no one cared to remember a shadow.
Now, let's shift gears to a figure who did leave her mark on history, not as a shadow, but as a force of divine fire. Olympias, the woman who would become the mother of Alexander the Great. Before she was the formidable Queen of Macedon, she was Myrtale, a princess of Epirus, a rugged land where tribes claimed lineage from the legendary Achilles. Whether or not heroic blood truly flowed through her veins, one thing was clear. Olympias was no ordinary royal, destined to fade into the background of history. Raised in a world steeped in mysticism, she was shaped by prophecy, ritual, and a fierce connection to the ancient gods. Unlike the typical princess stitching delicate tapestries, Olympias was drawn to the wild, serpents, omens, and the ecstatic rites of Dionysus, where women danced under starlit skies, their voices rising in frenzied communion with the divine. Her bond with the gods wasn't just ceremonial, it was visceral. Ancient sources, often penned by men both awestruck and unnerved, claimed she kept sacred snakes in her chambers, letting them slither across her bed as symbols of her divine favor. Was this truth, or the kind of slander hurled at powerful women? We may never know, but the stories stuck, painting her as both goddess and threat. To her allies, she was a living oracle. To her enemies, a dangerous enigma. Her power took root not in palaces or battlefields, but in the flickering glow of torchlit rituals, where priestesses chanted and serpents coiled, hinting at a force older than kingdoms and sharper than any blade. When Philip II of Macedon, brutal, brilliant, and famously insatiable, met Myrtale during a religious initiation on the island of Samothrace around 357 BCE, it wasn't just a meeting of royals, it was a clash of ambition and mystery. Their marriage wasn't a mere political contract, it was a fusion of prophecy and power, charged with omens from the start. Some said thunder roared across the sky on their wedding night. Others whispered that Olympias dreamed of a lightning bolt igniting her womb, a sign of the greatness to come. These tales, recorded in sources like Plutarch's Life of Alexander, became the stuff of legend. But one truth stood firm. Their union didn't just produce a child. It birthed Alexander the Great, a conqueror whose destiny Olympias vowed to shape from his first cry.
Yet life as Philip's queen was no gilded fairy tale. Macedon was a cauldron of ambition, where kings fell to rivals and brothers became enemies overnight. Philip, a master of conquest, with a habit of collecting wives for alliances, wasn't built for fidelity. Olympias, likely a teenager at the time of their marriage, entered this treacherous court with eyes wide open and a will of iron. She wasn't content to linger in the shadows. Holding her own court, forging her own alliances, and consulting oracles to chart her path, she wielded power with a priestess's intensity. While Philip amassed armies, Olympias cultivated a mystique, her every move tinged with divine purpose. Their marriage was a stormy blend of pride, paranoia, and prophecy, and from it a legacy was born that would echo through the ages. Olympias's vision for her son Alexander was nothing short of celestial. Legends swirled around his birth, steeped in divine portent. She claimed a thunderbolt pierced her womb in a dream, igniting flames that danced around her unborn child without harm. Philip II, her husband, reportedly saw himself sealing her womb with the image of a lion, a symbol of raw, untamed power. Whether these were true visions or carefully crafted myths, Olympias and Philip leaned into them, treating Alexander not as a mere prince, but as a force destined to conquer the world. Yet even as the court hailed the birth of a god-touched heir, fissures in their marriage grew. Olympias seethed at Philip's growing harem, particularly his marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman. This wasn't just a personal slight. It was a political dagger aimed at Alexander's future. Cleopatra, born of pure Macedonian stock, could produce a rival heir, one favored by the local elite over Olympias's Epirite blood. To Olympias, the palace wasn't a home, it was a battleground, and she would wield every ritual, omen, and alliance to secure her son's crown. By the time Alexander reached his teens, the royal court in Pella was a cauldron of intrigue, where every smile hid a blade and every whisper carried poison. Olympias wasn't just vying for influence, she was fighting for survival in a kingdom where loyalty shifted like sand. She knew the court was crawling with vipers, but she was the one who taught them how to strike. Philip, ever the conqueror, grew distant, consumed by campaigns, wine, and the council of Macedonian advisers who eyed Olympias with suspicion. The breaking point came with his marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice around 337 BCE, a union that threatened everything Olympias had built. Cleopatra's uncle, Attalus, a powerful general, held sway in Philip's inner circle, and their alliance was a direct challenge to Alexander's claim. At the wedding feast, Attalus, drunk on wine and hubris, hurled insults at Olympias and questioned Alexander's legitimacy, hinting he might be the spawn of a god rather than Philip's true son. It was a calculated jab, but Olympias turned it into a weapon. Let them whisper of Zeus, she'd make sure her son's divine aura made him untouchable. Furious, Alexander stormed out of the feast, and Olympias took a bolder step, retreating to her homeland of Epirus. This wasn't surrender, it was strategy. As a princess of Epirus, she held sway among her people, rallying allies and sowing seeds of discord from afar. Her absence was a silent threat, a reminder that she could destabilize Philip's court without setting foot in Pella. Then came the cataclysm. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, stabbed by a disgruntled bodyguard named Pausanias, just as he stood on the cusp of invading Persia. The timing was uncanny, the implications explosive. Who was behind it? Was Pausanias acting alone, driven by personal grudges? Was it court intrigue, a web of rival nobles? Did Alexander, impatient for the throne, play a role? Or, whisper it in the shadows, was it Olympias, the serpent queen, pulling invisible strings? Ancient sources, like Diodorus Siculus, offer no proof but plenty of suspicion, noting Olympias' ruthless ambition. No one dared accuse her openly, but the whispers lingered.
The aftermath was chaos, and Olympias seized it like a storm. While Macedon reeled, she moved with lethal precision. Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child, a potential rival to Alexander, were eliminated in a manner that sent chills through the court. Some accounts, like those in Plutarch's Life of Alexander, claim Olympias orchestrated a brutal spectacle. Cleopatra was forced to watch her infant daughter die before taking her own life, possibly by hanging. Others whisper of even darker fates, with the child burned on a pyre. The details are murky, but the message was clear. Olympias showed no mercy. In a world where royal courts rewarded strength and punished weakness, she understood that compassion was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her enemies weren't just defeated, they were erased, their deaths a warning to anyone who dared challenge her son's path to the throne. Olympias, once Myrtile, had become a force of divine wrath, ensuring Alexander's crown was forged in blood and fire. With Cleopatra Eurydice and her child eliminated, Olympias turned her unyielding focus to cementing her son Alexander's claim to the Macedonian throne. Her teenage son, brilliant, bold, and tutored by the philosopher Aristotle, ascended as king with startling ease, but don't be fooled into thinking it was all charisma and royal blood. Olympias was the unseen architect of his rise, a master of shadows who knew which generals to intimidate, which nobles to charm, and which threats to quietly erase. She wasn't just a mother guarding her son's future, she was a strategist forging his destiny. Ancient sources, like Plutarch's Life of Alexander, hint at her ruthless efficiency, suggesting she orchestrated purges to clear Alexander's path. Even Alexander, for all his ambition, didn't always approve of her methods, particularly the brutal deaths of Cleopatra's Eurydice's family. Yet he never stopped her, perhaps because he understood a grim truth Olympias had long embraced. In Macedon, power was won with blood, and bloodlines were both a crown and a curse.
Once Alexander was king, Olympias didn't settle into a quiet life of maternal pride. Retirement wasn't in her nature. Instead, she slipped into the shadows, trading overt strikes for subtle influence. As Alexander prepared to conquer Persia, she remained in Macedon, not as a passive queen mother, but as a fierce guardian of his divine mission. She sent him sacred talismans, consulted oracles to divine his fate, and performed rituals to invoke the god's favor. To Olympias, Alexander's campaigns weren't mere military ventures. They were the fulfillment of a prophecy she had woven since his birth. No rival, whether Macedonian, Persian, or divine, would derail her son's path to greatness. She was no longer Myrtale, the Epirote princess. She was Olympias, the serpent queen, her will as unyielding as the gods she served. As Alexander marched east, carving an empire from Egypt to India, Olympias held court in Macedon, a queen mother in title, but a ruler in truth. Though Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, was named regent, Olympias refused to be sidelined. She bombarded her son with letters, sharp, urgent missives that blended maternal concern with political cunning. These weren't tender notes of love. They were strategic dispatches, laced with warnings about disloyal allies and critiques of Alexander's growing fascination with Persian customs, his foreign brides, and his flirtation with godhood. Only Olympias dared to challenge the conqueror of the world, reminding him of the divine fire and the mother who had shaped him. A letter preserved in Athenaeus's Dipnosophisty shows her blunt style, urging Alexander to stay vigilant against betrayal. Back in Macedon, Olympias clashed with Antipater, undermining his authority at every turn. She leveraged her status, her ties to Epirus and Thessaly, and her mystic aura to sow discord among the aristocracy. Her whispers could spark rebellion faster than a general's sword, and she wielded them mercilessly. To Olympias, Antipater wasn't just a regent, he was a rival, a second Philip plotting to eclipse her influence. She warned Alexander of his ambition, painting him as a threat to the empire's stability. But Alexander, stretched thin by his conquests, hesitated to act, needing Antipater to hold Greece while he battled in Asia. The tension between mother and general simmered, a silent war of wills. Olympias watched, waited, and grew restless beneath her priestess's robes, her patience fraying as she refused to bow to a soldier's rule. When news of Alexander's death in Babylon reached Macedon in 323 BCE, it didn't arrive with fanfare. It struck like a poisoned blade. For Olympias, it was more than the loss of a son. It was the shattering of a divine vision she had nurtured for decades. Her boy, the God-touched conqueror she had raised to reshape the world, was gone, leaving no clear heir and an empire fracturing like glass. His generals, the so-called successors, descended like vultures, carving up his legacy with greedy hands. Antipater, still gripping power in Macedon and Greece, held no loyalty to Olympias. Worse, her daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, became a prize for ambitious warlords, each seeking to marry her and claim the Macedonian bloodline. Olympias saw the storm gathering. A civil war was no longer a threat, it was a certainty. The Serpent Queen, forged in prophecy and hardened by betrayal, prepared to strike once more, her eyes fixed on a throne that would not slip from her grasp. With Alexander gone,
Olympias faced a world unraveling into chaos. Her son's empire, a tapestry of conquest woven with divine ambition, was fraying at the edges. But Olympias, ever the serpent queen, saw one last thread to grasp. Her grandson, Alexander IV, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had married. This infant, barely a whisper of his father's legacy, was both a target and a tool, vulnerable yet invaluable. He was the last spark of Alexander's bloodline. Olympias allied herself with Roxana, vowing to shield the boy and wield his birthright as a weapon in the cutthroat arena of Macedonian politics. The generals who once knelt to Alexander now scoffed at bowing to his widow or his mother, their ambitions fueled by armies and grudges. But Olympias was undaunted. She had faced traitors, kings, and the venom of courtly snakes. Warlords with stolen crowns didn't faze her. So she schemed, watched, and waited, her eyes locked on Cassander, the cold-blooded son of her old rival Antipater, who had no patience for the Queen Mother's machinations. As Alexander's empire splintered into civil war, Olympias made her boldest move yet. She returned to Macedon in 317 BCE, not as a grieving mother, but as a storm of divine fury. Cassander, now consolidating power, had sidelined Roxana and Alexander IV, holding them as virtual prisoners. Olympias read the signs. If she didn't act, her grandson's legacy would vanish like ash in the wind. She forged an alliance with Polyperchon, an aging general clinging to a shred of legitimacy as regent. Backed by his forces, Olympias marched into Macedon, not to beg, but to rule. Her arrival was electric. Towns flung open their gates, soldiers abandoned their posts to join her, and even her enemies paused, struck by the weight of her name. Ancient sources, like Diodorus Siculus, describe her arrival as a tidal wave, her presence reigniting loyalties to Alexander's bloodline. Olympias, graying but unbowed, was a force that shook the earth.
Her vengeance was swift and merciless. She hunted Cassander's loyalists with surgical precision. Her wrath as theatrical as it was brutal. When she captured Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's mentally impaired half-brother and a puppet king propped up by rivals, she ordered his execution without hesitation. His wife, Eurydice, was offered a chance to take her own life, a grim nod to royal decorum, but when she refused, Olympias had her strangled, staging the act like a goddess dispensing justice. Justin's epitome recounts the chilling efficiency of these purges, noting Olympias's intent to crush any challenge to her grandson's claim. For a fleeting moment, she held Macedon in her iron grip, restoring Alexander's dynasty and reminding the kingdom what power looked like when wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. Her message was unmistakable. Only Alexander's blood deserved the throne. All others were impostors. But power in Macedon was as fleeting as a spark in a storm. Cassander, calculating and relentless, struck back with a vengeance. His armies dwarfed hers, his resources ran deeper, and his cruelty cut colder. Olympias's allies began to waver. Polyperchon's influence crumbled, and the tide turned against her. By 316 BCE, she found herself cornered in the coastal fortress of Pydna, besieged by Cassander's forces, who aimed to end the Serpent Queen once and for all. Yet Olympias didn't crumble.
For nearly a year she endured the siege with the defiance of a goddess carved in stone. Food dwindled, disease spread, and allies slipped away, but she refused to beg or bargain. Diodorus Siculus notes her unyielding resolve, describing her as a figure of divine wrath, even as the walls closed in. The smoke of her victories still lingered, but Cassandra's army was at the gates, and the Serpent Queen's final stand was drawing to a close.
Trapped within the weathered walls of Pydna's coastal fortress in 316 BCE, Olympias stood unbroken, her presence as commanding as ever. Even as starvation gnawed at her garrison, she carried herself not as a cornered queen, but as the mother of a god. Cassandra, her cold-eyed nemesis, hesitated to strike. Olympias wasn't just a woman, she was a myth, cloaked in the aura of Alexander the Great. To kill her risked sacrilege, a stain that could haunt a kingdom. He offered her a lifeline, surrender and live. But Olympias, forged in decades of betrayal, saw through his hollow promise. She had watched too many royal oaths crumble to dust. As hunger turned to death and her followers faltered, the Serpent Queen's resolve held firm, until her garrison broke and she was delivered to her enemies. Cassandra, ever calculating, didn't stain his hands with her blood. Instead, he handed her to the families of those she'd executed during her vengeful return to Macedon. Let them judge her, he said. Their verdict was death, but when the executioners faced her, they froze. Olympias stood tall, her gaze piercing like a seer's through sacred smoke, her regal bearing unshaken. These were Macedonians, raised on tales of her rituals, her serpents, her divine son. To them she was no mere mortal, but a figure of awe and dread. Not one could lift a blade against her. Frustrated, Cassandra turned to outsiders, mercenaries, untouched by her legend, men who saw only a task, not a queen. And so Olympias fell, not with pomp or honor, but in silence, her life snuffed out like a candle in the wind. With her death, the last true spark of Alexander's bloodline faded, and the empire built on her divine ambition crumbled into shadow. Ancient sources like Diodorus Siculus mark her end as the closing of an era, the final note of a dynasty forged in fire.
Yet history has a way of remembering those who burn brightest, even in defeat. Olympias didn't die on a throne or in silken robes. She fell in the dust, betrayed and alone. But her story didn't end there. Unlike the medieval assassins who vanished without a trace, Olympias etched her name into the ages. She wasn't just Alexander's mother. She was his architect, weaving myths of thunderbolts and lions to crown him divine. Without her ruthless purges, her cunning alliances, and her unyielding will, there might not have been a teenage king to conquer the world. Unlike warrior queens like Cleopatra or Boudica, Olympias fought not with armies, but with subtler weapons, whispered prophecies, strategic marriages, and the power of belief. She made Macedon believe her son was a god. Perhaps she believed it too.
Her enemies called her a sorceress, a schemer, a killer, and they weren't wrong. In a world that rewarded cunning over compassion, Olympias played the game better than most, wielding motherhood like a blade and divinity like a shield. Centuries later, her legacy endures, both vilified and revered. To some, she was a monster, to others, a visionary. But no historian, from Plutarch to modern scholars, could dismiss her as insignificant. She lingers in Alexander's shadow, a phantom behind the curtain, her presence felt in every tale of ruthless queens and blood-forged empires. Olympias wasn't a tragic figure or a mere footnote. She was a story in her own right, a woman who danced with serpents, shaped destinies, and outlasted gods. Her bones may have turned to dust, but her legend coils eternal, whispering of power, prophecy, and a mother's unbreakable will.
And now, let's turn our gaze to a place steeped in its own ancient mysteries, the sun-scorched island of Crete, just south of modern Heraklion. Here, among crumbling stones and whispering winds, lies a ruin that feels less like history and more like a dream caught in time. On the sun-drenched island of Crete, just south of modern Heraklion, lies a place where history and legend intertwine like threads in a tapestry. Knossos, the heart of the Minoan civilization. Its stone corridors twist and turn, rooms loop back on themselves, and staircases vanish into dead ends, disorienting even the modern visitor. Built around 1900 BCE and expanded over centuries, Knossos wasn't just a palace, it was a city under one sprawling roof, stretching across nearly 150,000 square feet. With over 1,000 chambers, it boasted light wells, storage vaults, sacred shrines, bustling workshops, and possibly the earliest flushing toilets in history. Its sophisticated plumbing, multi-level apartments, and intricate ventilation systems were not the crude trappings of a primitive fort, but the hallmarks of an architectural marvel. To ancient travelers, Knossos must have shimmered like a mirage of divine ingenuity. To modern archaeologists, it's a labyrinth of organized chaos that whispers secrets with every turn. In the early 20th century, Arthur Evans unearthed Knossos, peeling back layers of earth to reveal a site that seemed to pulse with myth. He was convinced this was the cradle of the Greek legend of the labyrinth and the Minotaur, a tale of a monstrous half-man, half-bull trapped in a maze so cunning that none who entered could escape. Evans found clues everywhere. Bull motifs adorned frescoes, etched stones, and delicate gold charms, signaling the animal's sacred place in Minoan culture. He named the civilization after King Minos, the mythical ruler tied to the tale, though whether Minos was a real figure or a shadow of legend remains unclear.
Yet no literal labyrinth, no subterranean maze or beastly prison has ever been found. Instead, Knossos offers something more enigmatic, a palace designed with deliberate complexity, its winding paths and layered wings evoking a maze without needing one. Was the palace itself the monster? Or did it birth the myth that still haunts it? Knossos doesn't yield answers easily, but it compels us to ask questions that echo through time. The Minotaur myth is as enduring as the ruins themselves. It tells of King Minos, Crete's mighty ruler, who demanded a grim tribute from Athens, 7 young men and 7 maidens each year,
sent to be devoured by the Minotaur, a creature born of divine wrath and hidden shame, locked in an inescapable labyrinth. Only Theseus, the Athenian hero, defeated the beast, guided by a thread from Princess Ariadne. But where did this story spring from? To the ancient Greeks, Crete was a land of awe and unease, its Minoan people both sophisticated and alien. Their seafaring culture, with its bull-leaping rituals and strange deities, felt otherworldly. Frescoes at Knossos depict acrobats vaulting over charging bulls, while stylized bull horns, known as horns of consecration, crown rooftops and altars. To a Greek visitor in 1000 BCE, the palace's dizzying layout and exotic rites might have seemed like stepping into a realm of gods and monsters. The Minotaur itself may be more than a creature. Some scholars, like those cited in John Chadwick's The Mycenaean World, suggest the myth reflects a memory of Minoan dominance over the Aegean, when Athens paid tribute to Crete's naval might. The labyrinth could symbolize the political entrapment of weaker city-states, the Minotaur embodying the raw power behind Minoan rule. Others see a deeper metaphor, the labyrinth as the tangled depths of the human psyche, the Minotaur as suppressed desires, and Theseus as the courage to face the darkness, guided by the fragile thread of reason. Knossos, with its maze-like design, is the closest we've come to a real labyrinth. No monster, no Ariadne, but a place where history and myth blur into something greater. It's not just a palace, it's a question, a riddle that invites us to wonder whether the Minoans built a myth or the myth built them.
Before Athens raised its marble temples or Sparta forged its warriors, the Minoans crafted one of Europe's earliest advanced societies, their legacy etched in the stones of Knossos. Like Olympius, who wielded prophecy and ruthlessness to shape an empire, the Minoans left a shadow that lingers in myth, their palace a testament to a civilization that was both history and legend. The Minoans didn't conquer with swords, they ruled with trade, art, and an architectural prowess that bordered on the supernatural. From roughly 2600 to 1400 BCE, they thrived on Crete, weaving a vast trade network that stretched across the Mediterranean, touching Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant coasts of Iberia. Their sleek ships glided like whispers over the waves, carrying pottery, saffron, bronze, and luxuries that turned wealth into power. Unlike their Greek successors, the Minoans didn't rely on armies, but on alliances, their influence spreading through diplomacy and commerce rather than conquest. At the heart of this enigmatic civilization stood Knossos, not merely a palace, but a vibrant hub of culture, ritual, and economy, a city pulsing with life under a single, sprawling roof. Minoan culture was a stark contrast to the warlike Greeks who followed. Their art celebrated the rhythm of nature, dolphins leaping through waves, dancers swaying in vibrant frescoes, and athletes vaulting over bulls in daring rituals that blended courage and grace. Their goddesses, bare-breasted and wielding snakes, radiated power, fertility, and transformation, far removed from the punitive deities of later myths. Knossos itself, nestled in a fertile valley rather than perched on a fortified hill,
reflected this confidence. It lacked towering defensive walls, suggesting either an island secure in its isolation or a civilization so formidable that walls were redundant. With multi-story buildings, colonnaded courtyards, and advanced plumbing systems, Knossos was a marvel of engineering, centuries ahead of its time. Yet, for all their sophistication, the Minoans left no decipherable voice. Their script, Linear A, remains a locked vault guarding their true name, beliefs, and secrets. We're left with their ruins, their art, and their echo in Greek myths, absorbed by the Mycenaeans and woven into tales like the Minotaur's labyrinth.
To step into Knossos is to wander through a tapestry of time, layered, disorienting, and breathtaking. Spanning roughly 150,000 square feet, the palace unfolds across over 1,000 chambers, from cramped storerooms to grand halls, all orbiting a vast central courtyard that likely hosted bull-leaping ceremonies or sacred rites. Its corridors twist like vines, splitting and doubling back. Staircases spiral into shadows or spill into sunlit courtyards. Light wells pierce the structure, channeling air and daylight, while clay pipes carry rainwater to flush toilets, a feat that predates Roman engineering. To navigate Knossos demanded a sharp mind, or, as the myth of Theseus suggests, a guiding thread. Ancient visitors might have whispered labyrinth as they wandered its maze-like paths, and it's easy to see why. Knossos wasn't just a building, it was a living enigma, designed with an intelligence that feels almost alive. One of its most striking features is the so-called throne room, named for an alabaster seat carved into the wall, flanked by benches and guarded by frescoes of griffins, mythical protectors of the divine. Was this the seat of a priest-king, a goddess's sanctuary, or a council chamber? The answer eludes us, but the room's aura speaks of power. The walls themselves sing in color. Dolphins swim above bathtubs, women in flounced skirts move with elegance, and youths leap over bulls in mid-air, their movements frozen in vibrant hues. This art wasn't mere decoration, it was the soul of Minoan identity, tied to earth, sea, and ritual. Yet the deeper you venture, the more Knossos unsettles. Its layout seems deliberately confounding, as if meant to bewilder outsiders. Was this intentional? A design to protect sacred spaces or confuse invaders? Knossos doesn't reveal its purpose, but like Olympias, who wove myth and power into an empire, it leaves a shadow that whispers of mystery, inviting us to question whether it was a palace, a labyrinth, or something greater still. Knossos was more than a palace. It was a living myth, a place where architecture breathed with divine purpose. Its winding corridors and disorienting layout weren't just a defense or a quirk. They were a reflection of the Minoan soul, weaving ritual, mystery, and awe into every stone. Unlike the towering Greek temples to Zeus or Athena that would come later, Knossos didn't need a single grand shrine. The entire palace was a temple, its very design a bridge to the divine. Hidden alcoves housed sacred spaces, pillars stood like silent guardians, and stylized bull horns, symbols of reverence, adorned rooftops and altars. The bull, central to Minoan worship, wasn't feared, but exalted. Frescoes capture young men and women vaulting over charging bulls in a ritual dance, a breathtaking blend of danger and grace that was less a sport than a sacred act.
perhaps a tribute to the gods or a triumph over chaos itself. These images, vibrant with life, suggest a culture that saw divinity in movement and courage.
Among the palace's treasures are the snake goddess figurines, unearthed in storerooms and now iconic symbols of Minoan spirituality. These bare-breasted figures, serpents coiling around their arms or torsos, radiate an unyielding power, guardians of fertility, rebirth, or the mysteries of the underworld. To the Minoans, snakes were not threats, but emblems of renewal, creatures that straddled earth and the divine. Found in quiet corners that may have served as household shrines, these figurines hint at a spirituality woven into daily life, where the sacred and the mundane are blurred. Knossos itself was a ritual machine, its labyrinthine paths, vibrant art, and hidden altars creating a space where every step felt like a journey toward the gods. As John Chadwick notes, in the Mycenaean world, the palace's design fused function with faith, its corridors not just passages, but pathways to the divine, echoing with prayers that have long since faded. For centuries, Knossos stood as a beacon of Minoan brilliance, its trade networks spanning the Mediterranean, its art celebrating life, and its architecture defying time. But around 1400 BCE, the light went out. The palace was abandoned, its frescoes left to peel, its corridors silenced. The Minoan civilization, once a shimmering force in the Aegean, vanished like a wave retreating from the shore. What caused this collapse? Theories swirl like the palace's own winding halls. Some point to nature's wrath. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, unleashed one of history's most cataclysmic blasts, likely sending tsunamis crashing into Crete's northern coast. Ash clouds may have choked the skies, starving crops and disrupting trade. While Knossos survived the initial devastation, the economic and spiritual toll could have fractured its foundations. Archaeological evidence, like ash layers found on Crete, suggests a slow decline rather than a sudden end. Others look at human hands. By 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans, warlike Greeks from the mainland, were rising in power. Their influence creeps into Knossos' later layers, where martial art replaces Minoan fluidity, and Linear A, the undeciphered Minoan script, gives way to Linear B, a Mycenaean writing system. Was this a conquest, a gradual takeover through trade and influence, or a cultural absorption? Some scholars, like those cited in Leonard Palmer's Mycenaeans and Minoans, argue the Mycenaeans exploited Minoan weakness post-Thera, reshaping Crete's identity. Others suggest internal strife, uprisings, elite failures, or political instability. Yet the ruins tell a haunting tale. No charred bones, no signs of slaughter. Knossos didn't fall in a blaze of violence. It slipped away quietly, its end as enigmatic as its labyrinthine heart. Like Olympias, who wove power and myth only to fade into shadow, the Minoans left a legacy that whispers through time. Their palace, a riddle that invites us to chase its secrets. The great palace of Knossos didn't fall in a blaze of glory. It faded into silence. By around 1400 BCE, its vibrant halls went still, its rituals ceased, and nature began to reclaim the stones. The Minoan civilization, once a radiant force in the Aegean, dissolved like mist over the sea. When Homer later sang of Crete in his epics,
Knossos was already a ghost, its memory woven into tales of kings, monsters, and labyrinths. Perhaps that's fitting. What ended Knossos wasn't just a volcano's wrath or an invader's sword, but the relentless march of time, which buries even the grandest empires under the weight of new ages. Yet the ruins endured, silent beneath Crete's soil, waiting to whisper their secrets once more. For over 3 millennia, Knossos lay hidden, its walls swallowed by olive groves and dust, its name reduced to myth. Then came Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist driven by a passion for Homeric tales and a flair for the dramatic. In 1900, Evans purchased the land where local farmers had unearthed strange seals and artifacts, hints of a forgotten world beneath their fields. His excavations revealed a palace so vast and intricate that he declared it the home of King Minos, the heart of the labyrinth legend. The frescoes, bull motifs, and architectural complexity convinced him he'd found the source of the Minotaur myth. Evans didn't just uncover stones, he reimagined a civilization, naming its people the Minoans, after the mythical king. His work was bold, sometimes controversial. He restored parts of Knossos with reinforced concrete, blending ancient ruins with Edwardian vision, a move praised as visionary by some and criticized as overreach by others. Yet, as Leonard Palmer notes in Mycenaeans and Minoans, Evans' efforts brought a Bronze Age world back to life, revealing a civilization older and more sophisticated than classical Greece. He also uncovered Linear A, the Minoans' undeciphered script, opening a window into a language we still can't read, a mystery that deepens Knossos' enigma.
At the heart of this vision is the double axe, or labrys, a symbol carved into stones, painted on walls, and placed in shrines. Some scholars, like those cited in Martin P. Nilsson's The Minoan Mycenaean Religion, propose it was tied to female divinity or celestial cycles, perhaps giving rise to the word labyrinth itself, not a maze, but a sacred house of the double axe. The horns of consecration, stylized bull horns crowning walls and altars, marked sacred spaces, separating the divine from the everyday. Bulls, central to Minoan spirituality, appear everywhere, leaping in frescoes, etched in stone, symbolizing power and reverence. These symbols, paired with the palace's maze-like design, suggest Knossos wasn't just a seat of power, but a sacred stage, where rituals and architecture merged into a living myth. Like Olympias, who shaped empires with prophecy and cunning, or the assassins who vanished into shadow, the Minoans crafted a legacy that endures in mystery. Their palace, a riddle that hums beneath the earth, inviting us to chase its secrets through time.
The Palace of Knossos wasn't just a marvel of stone. It was a canvas of meaning. Its bull motifs and winding corridors, whispering a language we can only half understand. Some archaeologists, like those cited in Martin P. Nilsson's The Minoan Mycenaean Religion, suggest its layout mirrored cosmic or seasonal cycles.
each turn of its maze-like halls symbolizing a journey through life, death, or the underworld. The bull, omnipresent in frescoes and carvings, may have embodied fertility, divine power, or the taming of chaos, but its true significance eludes us. Without a deciphered linear A script, the Minoans' thoughts remain locked in their art, leaving us to chase shadows of meaning. Were the palace's twists and turns a spiritual path, not a prison? Was Knossos a reflection of the heavens or a map of the soul? We see the symbols, dolphins, lilies, double axes, but their full story slips through our fingers like a thread unraveling into myth.
From the enigmatic halls of Knossos, where architecture wove myth and mystery, we turn to a different kind of ancient ingenuity, the battering ram, a brute force of engineering that turned walls into rubble. In their earliest form, rams were raw and simple. Soldiers hefted massive logs, slamming them into gates with relentless fury, like a heartbeat of destruction. But by the 7th century BCE, the Assyrians transformed them into weapons of dread. Mounted on wheeled frames, shielded by roofs against a hail of arrows, stones, and scalding pitch, these rams rolled forward like unstoppable beasts. Reliefs from Nineveh, as noted in David Hamblin's The First Armies, show iron-tipped rams battering city gates and watchtowers, their crews enduring a storm of missiles to keep the rhythm alive. A stalled ram was a sitting target, vulnerable to fire and counterattacks, but when it struck true, it was wood and metal against mortal masonry, a clash of ancient physics that left defenses crumbling like ash. If the ram was the brute, the catapult was the strategist, hurling destruction from afar with a precision that felt almost sorcerous. Emerging in the Greek world around the 4th century BCE, catapults were born from the ingenuity of tyrants like Dionysius of Syracuse, who sought to revolutionize siege warfare. These torsion-powered machines, using twisted sinew or hair as springs, stored and released energy with devastating force, as described in Diodorus Siculus's Library of History. Ballistas fired massive bolts like giant crossbows, piercing wooden gates, while stone-throwing catapults lobbed boulders to shatter battlements or crush defenders. The Romans refined these designs, crafting portable siege engines that could be disassembled, transported, and rebuilt on the battlefield. Some Roman catapults, capable of launching 60-pound stones at blistering speeds, turned city walls into targets. Beyond destruction, catapults were psychological weapons. Generals launched corpses or severed heads over walls to sow disease and despair, an early form of biological terror. Yet their weight and need for skilled crews made them vulnerable to terrain and sabotage. Still, they taught cities a new truth. Walls could no longer shield from the sky.
Where catapults struck with cunning, trebuchets reigned with majesty, their towering frames and creaking arms a declaration that no fortification was safe. Unlike their tension-driven cousins, trebuchets harnessed gravity's pull, using a swinging arm balanced on a sturdy frame with a heavy counterweight on one end and a sling on the other. Drop the weight, and the arm whipped upward, launching projectiles in a soaring arc. Originating as traction models in China around the 4th century BCE, where crews pulled ropes to power the arm, the counterweight trebuchet emerged in the 12th century through Byzantine or Islamic intermediaries, as noted in Paul E. Sheridan's studies on medieval siege technology. In Europe, it became the undisputed monarch of siege warfare,
spreading through castles and crusades. A well-crafted trebuchet could hurl 300-pound stones over 300 meters, pulverizing towers, breaching walls, or shattering morale with each thunderous strike. Its high, graceful arc allowed it to lob projectiles over defenses with pinpoint accuracy, not just destroying, but dominating. Like the labyrinthine Knossos, the calculated schemes of Olympius, or the silent strikes of assassins, trebuchets embodied ingenuity and power, reshaping the battlefield with every swing.
Trebuchets didn't just break walls, they broke spirits. These towering giants of medieval siege warfare turned gravity into a weapon, their long arms swinging with a slow, inevitable force that made fortifications tremble. A heavy counterweight dropped, whipping a sling into a high arc, launching stones, burning pitch, or even diseased carcasses over walls with devastating precision. Originating in China around the 4th century BCE as traction models powered by human muscle, the counterweight trebuchet, refined by Byzantine and Islamic engineers, swept through Europe by the 12th century, as Paul E. Chevedden details in his studies on medieval siege technology. Capable of hurling 300-pound projectiles over 300 meters, they could shatter towers or crater courtyards, targeting barracks and supplies with surgical accuracy. At the 1304 siege of Stirling Castle, the legendary Warwolf trebuchet was so fearsome that the defenders offered surrender before it fired, only for the king to refuse, eager to unleash its wrath. Slow to build and reload, requiring skilled crews, trebuchets were nonetheless unmatched in range and terror, a divine hammer that made cities hold their breath with every swing.
While trebuchets struck from afar, siege towers brought the fight to the enemy's doorstep, rolling up to city walls like wooden titans. Clad in wet hides to resist fire, bristling with archers and spearmen, these mobile fortresses were the ancient equivalent of an armored assault vehicle. The Assyrians pioneered early versions in the 9th century BCE, but the Hellenistic kingdoms elevated them to spectacle. During the 305 BCE siege of Rhodes, Demetrius Poliorcetes Helipolis, or Taker of Cities, loomed over 100 feet tall, armed with catapults and sheathed in iron plates, as described in Diodorus Siculus's Library of History. Though it collapsed under its own ambition, the concept was sound. Siege towers turned walls into bridges, allowing attackers to storm battlements directly. Archers on upper decks rained arrows, while troops below prepared to leap onto ramparts via dropped gangplanks. Yet their size made them sluggish, vulnerable to fire, mud, or counter-defenses like ditches and inner walls. When they worked, though, they turned sieges into chaos, transforming a fortified city into a vertical battlefield where hand-to-hand combat decided the day. If trebuchets and towers were loud, tunneling was the silent assassin of siege warfare, striking from beneath the earth. Sappers dug beneath city walls, propping tunnels with wooden beams, then set them ablaze, collapsing the ground and the fortifications above. This invisible tactic, refined by the Assyrians and mastered by Greeks, Persians, and medieval Europeans, was as horrifying as it was effective. During the 429 BCE siege of Plataea, Spartans tunneled under the walls, only to be thwarted by defenders' counter-tunnels, leading to desperate underground skirmishes, as Thucydides recounts in History of the Peloponnesian War.
Countermining turned soil into a battlefield, with soldiers straining in the dark for the faint clink of enemy picks. No grand engines or soaring projectiles here, just the slow, relentless grind of digging and fire, crumbling a city's foundation like a whispered betrayal. Like the assassin's silent strikes, Olympias's calculated purges, or Knossos' labyrinthine complexity, tunneling was a study in precision and patience, proving that even the mightiest walls could fall to a shadow below.
While trebuchets hurled destruction from above, sappers worked in the shadows below, turning the earth itself into a weapon. Tunneling, or sapping, was a silent, sinister art. Dig beneath a city's walls, shore up the tunnel with wooden beams, then burn them to collapse the foundation. The result was catastrophic. A fortified wall could crumble in moments, leaving defenders stunned. During the 1212 siege of Rochester Castle, King John's forces tunneled under the southern wall, packing the mine with pig fat to fuel a blazing collapse, as chronicled in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The tower above fell, and surrender followed. By the 13th century, siege engineers were part geologists, part demolitionists, reading soil and stone to plan precise collapses. The real terror came in counter-mining, where defenders dug to intercept enemy tunnels, leading to brutal torchlit skirmishes underground. As Thucydides describes in History of the Peloponnesian War during the 429 BCE siege of Plataea, soldiers clashed with knives and shovels in claustrophobic darkness, where every clink of a pick was a countdown to violence. Tunneling wasn't glorious. It was grim, patient, and devastating, a subterranean strike that mirrored the assassin's silent lethality. Attackers brought engines, but defenders wielded ingenuity and fury. Chief among their weapons was Greek fire, a Byzantine invention from the 7th century CE that burned like liquid wrath. Sprayed from siphons or hurled in clay pots, this napalm-like substance clung to wood, stone, and flesh, unquenchable even by water. Its formula, a closely guarded secret lost with the Byzantine Empire, turned fleets into flaming ruins, as recounted in Anna Komnena's Alexiad. Less mysterious, but equally brutal, were boiling liquids, water, oil, or sand, poured from murder holes above gates and towers. Oil was the worst, seeping into armor and clothing before igniting, turning warriors into living torches. Hot sand, slipping into gaps at necks and wrists, caused excruciating burns, reducing attackers to chaos. Defenders also harnessed gravity, dropping stones, logs, or rotting carcasses from parapets to smash siege engines and morale. Traps like hidden pits, collapsing bridges, or spiked barricades turned castles into mazes of pain, designed to stall invaders until supplies dwindled or reinforcements arrived. Like Olympias's calculated purges, these tactics were a blend of creativity and cruelty, buying time with every scorching drop.
Siege warfare wasn't just about breaking walls. It was about breaking wills. Every groaning siege tower, every trebuchet soaring boulder was a performance of dread, designed to scream one truth: you are not safe. Assyrian commanders paraded their rams across deserts with theatrical flair, as seen in Nineveh reliefs, while Romans built siege camps in plain view, letting defenders watch catapults take shape. As Josephus notes in The Jewish War, the payloads themselves were messages of terror: severed heads, still clad in armor, or disease-ridden corpses launched over walls to spread panic and plague. During the 1453 siege of Constantinople, Ottoman forces bombarded defenders with bodies alongside stones, a grim tactic to shatter morale. Like Knossos' labyrinth, which was disoriented with its complexity, or the assassin's silent strikes, siege warfare was a psychological labyrinth, where fear was the thread that unraveled resistance before the first stone fell. In siege warfare, destruction was only half the battle. The other half was fear, a weapon as potent as any trebuchet. The Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, as described in Gabriele de Musi's chronicles, saw plague-ridden corpses hurled over walls, seeding panic and possibly sparking the Black Death spread in Europe. A trebuchet's arrival was a proclamation, its creaking ropes and groaning counterweights like the pulse of an approaching tempest. Defenders didn't just fear the stones, they dreaded the unknown. Would it be a boulder, a barrel of fire, or a silent pause as engineers honed their aim? The rhythmic thud of a battering ram or the eerie quiet before a catapult shot gnawed at nerves, driving defenders to despair. Commanders, masters of this theater, orchestrated terror to convince cities their gods had forsaken them, their walls mere sandcastles against fate. As Polybius notes in his histories, the goal was to shatter resolve, often opening gates without a fight when the defenders' spirits broke first.
The medieval age of siege engines, rams, catapults, trebuchets, ended with a thunderous shift as gunpowder reshaped warfare. By the 15th century, cannons emerged as the new titans, their iron shots tearing through stone walls in moments, as seen in the 1453 fall of Constantinople, chronicled by Michael Christobulus. Fortresses once deemed impregnable became fragile relics, their parapets splintering under cannon fire. Siege warfare turned explosive, brutal, and deafening, rendering traditional defenses obsolete. Yet the ancient engineer's legacy endured. Cannons, like catapults, harnessed physics, trajectory, force, and precision perfected centuries earlier. Modern artillery, from howitzers to ballistic missiles, traces its lineage to the torsion springs of Dionysius's catapults and the gravity-driven arcs of trebuchets. Even the psychological shock and awe of today's warfare echoes the ancient spectacle of siege towers rolling forward, flags snapping as a city's morale crumbles before its stones. The scars of ancient sieges remain etched in history, at Masada, where Roman ramps still rise from the desert, or Constantinople, whose layered walls stood a millennium until cannons prevailed. Castles across Europe, with their rounded towers and angled bastions, tell of a world constantly rearming against the next assault. Siege warfare hasn't vanished, it's evolved. Today's sieges use digital walls, firewalls, blockades, or information blackouts, but the essence remains. One side seeks to breach, the other to hold fast. Like the assassin's silent blades, Olympias's calculated purges, or Knossos' labyrinthine enigma, siege warfare is a dance of patience, ingenuity, and fear. Battering rams and trebuchets are now museum relics, but their spirit lives in every strategy that seeks to break the unbreakable, whether by stone, steel, or code. The siege endures, as eternal as the human will to conquer or resist.